Some weapons should just be called checkmate devices. What's up, meta nerds? This video is all about the E-Web heavy repeating blaster cannon. We'll start with when we see it first, during the Battle of Hoth. We'll get into how it works and all the different variants, but do be warned, we will get into some major spoilers for The Mandalorian Season 1 finale. But let's start by looking at how the Stormtroopers use this thing, because of course they were well trained with it, and use it as the manufacturer intended, which is not true for the Rebels and Mando that we'll look at in a bit. On this icy world, we see the invading Imperial forces lugging an E-Web, just in case they come upon any entrenched fighters or ships and vehicles. This also would have been valuable in overpowering any personal shield generators. Here we see that the two-man crew was able to assemble the weapon in just a few seconds, but they are cut down by the Millennium Falcon. This first debut really doesn't show off its incredible power, but it does start to show us how this thing works. This box was an Exagol class 4TS power generator, which also contained a state-of-the-art GK3 cryo-cooler unit. Inserting the gun into the tripod base was simple enough, but it was this powerful bolt generating and system cooling combo that required the two-man crew. That and of course the fact that you just needed two people to carry the thing around. The cannon itself weighed 38 kilograms or 84 pounds. But once you wanted to fire, you really needed this technician. An Imperial gunner known by the name Radon says, "Without a second man, it's very hard to shoot an E-Web. There's no fire control, you can't nurse your power supply or watch the cooler." What he means is that the technician is actively adjusting the amount of power and Tabana gas supplied to the cannon, and the amount of coolant used in direct reaction to the gunner's rate of fire. Some other quirks are that the power generator would take 15 minutes to be able to operate if it was cold. To get around this, the technicians would often keep theirs pre-charged, though this was known to make their job even harder, and deadly overcharge malfunctions more likely. This may seem like a lot of work, but it was only 8,000 credits. It's only about 10 times a DL-44 blaster pistol, and just 4 times the cheap B-1 battle droid. And that even came with an encrypted, built-in comlink system that worked like a local network between each of the cannons. This helped the Imperials to carry out some stealthy raids, but that does work both ways, as many rebels and criminal organizations were also drawn to this weapon's low cost, and this uncrackable comm system. The E-Web's range was also impressive, 200 meters optimum with 750 meters max range, which was 4x and 10x the range of the DL-44 respectively. Years before the Battle of Hoth, we saw them used by the Mining Guild to keep Purrgil away from their gas refinery. And we also see that despite being incredibly powerful, these bolts can be deflected by a lightsaber, like what we see with Kanan. It should also be noted that these Mining Guild ones fire yellow-colored bolts, something we usually only see with the Mandalorian blasters. And if you were wondering, it has never been fully explained why it has this color. Another thing that made it appealing to rebel groups is that it could be operated easily by a novice. Just point and shoot with almost no recoil. And even for targets at a distance, there was this easy-to-use scope. But of course, this thing was a primary target of incoming enemy fire, and thus you could have inexperienced fighters losing their nerve in the middle of battle.
Get the fight! Man those cannons!
But when correctly laying shots down range, it could easily blast holes in enemy vehicles. And in this case, on Lothal, it actually forced Imperial dropships to quickly turn tail. Now what's funny is that the manufacturer claims that this weapon is simply too large to be carried by a single person. You just can't do it. Which is why both Zeb and the Mandalorian prove that sometimes it's better to just try it out. Stronger than your average stormtrooper this guide was written for, the Lasat can easily wield this powerful blaster. And we see that when these bolts hit their target, it can easily blow apart a dropship with just a few shots. But we do see that once it's disconnected from its power source and Tabana gas, the blaster burns through the little bit that was still charged in the weapon in just a few seconds. But of course, it can always work as a melee weapon at that point. Jumping forward to the year 9 ABY, we are in the era of the Imperial Remnant, and on the planet Navarro, Moff Gideon gives a whole monologue praising some of the moments that made this weapon infamous throughout the galaxy. He starts with how it was used with ruthless effectiveness against the Republic shock troopers.
She has witnessed many of her ranks vaporized mid-descent, facing the predecessor of this particular model.
Dune actually hinted at this in a previous episode, and though her tattoo seems symbolic of the Republic shock troopers and their iconic red color scheme, Cara was with Special Forces in the Rebellion. But once the Alliance transitioned into the New Republic, these shock troopers did take on a similar role to the old Coruscant Guard, defending dignitaries and acting as riot police.
Then when the imps were gone, the politics started. We were peacekeepers, protecting delegates, suppressing riots, not what I signed up for.
But we also learn how this weapon was key to conquering the homeworld of one of the toughest people in the galaxy, how the Empire used it to take control of Mandalore, an event that has been built up a lot in the Rebel series.
Has heard the songs of the siege of Mandalore, when gunships outfitted with similar ordnance laid waste to fields of Mandalorian recruits in the night of 1,000 tears.
This is how they got all that Beskar in Imperial hands, and what forced this once proud people to go into hiding. Unlike Zeb, the Mandalorian knew enough about this weapon to not disconnect it from its hose, so he would retain that full firepower, just of course that added difficulty since he's carrying it all himself. This is able to rip through ranks of stormtroopers, but what's interesting is just how deadly the explosion was when Moff Gideon fired at the generator. The blast isn't even directly on the Mandalorian, yet it sent him flying through the air and would have killed him if he did not receive medical attention. There was so much power in this generator that it was that deadly even through his incredible Beskar armor and undersuit. So that's it for its history and breakdown, and as for the cool facts and behind the scenes stuff, there are actually several different versions of this weapon. Moff Gideon even mentions that the one that he's using is a successor to the more infamous versions, and the gunship mounted cousin of the E-Web. The F-Web had this triple blaster system, and even a shield generator, though this system was even more complicated and needed a third crew member. The E-Web 15 was able to cut down the startup time to just 5 minutes, ironically down from 15, and some of these would work in a deflector shield generator as well. During the Clone Wars era, the go-to was the EWHB-12 heavy repeating blaster, and many see that the Imperial E-Web was actually a step backwards, because this Republic era one could target enemy clankers and fire automatically, without the need of anyone manning it. Then there was this E-Web rifle, which was made from the same manufacturer and used a lot of the same design features, really noticeable in the barrel, but of course functioned more like a standard heavy blaster rifle, and this was also used during the Battle of Hoth. The E-Web has also appeared in the LEGO Star Wars game, and a lot of this information comes from the Star Wars role-playing core book, the New Essential Guide to Weapons Technology, and the Essential Guide to Warfare in the Imperial Sourcebook. And most important of all, remember, hit the gym hard, so that you too can defy the owner's manual, just don't unplug it like a Lasat, and the Force will be with you, always. If you ever need a getaway vehicle, be sure to hijack an ITT. What's up, meta nerds? In today's video, we're going to be talking about the Imperial Troop Transport, or ITT, a vehicle that originates in Legends but has made a big comeback in canon. The specs and even the design for this vehicle do differ between Legends and canon, so let's start with the Legends. This vehicle was first known as the Reconnaissance Troop Transport, or RTT, and it was built by Santh Sinar Technologies, the parent company of all the different subsidiaries that made everything from the TIE Fighters, TIE Maulers, and other ground vehicles like the Sentry Tank. The RTT was 6.4 meters long, about 2/3 in AAT, or just over 3.5 cents. It had a top speed of 150 km per hour, or 93 miles per hour, making it 100 km per hour slower than the average X-34 land speeder. Its crew was just a single pilot and a gunner, but in some cases a second gunner would be used. For transport, you could carry up to 6 troops on these outside racks, which also allowed them to fire independently while traveling. Although you do get the extra firepower, these troops would be open to the elements and incoming enemy fire. The rear of the RTT had what was called a prisoner immobilization unit, which could be used to detain both organics and droids. And for armament, the RTT had this turret with 2 light blaster cannons. Now the design of the cannon version does differ, where the front is now more squared off, and they add these 2 extra blaster cannons. And all the cannon versions have transparent steel in the viewports, whereas in Legends sometimes these just appear to be openings. But what does stay the same is that turret packs a big punch, and we see that it can be used effectively against land and air targets. In canon, the Imperial Troop Transport, or ITT, was built by Ubrikian Industries, the same people who gave us Jabba's sail barge and the Bantha II skiff. It also gets an official model number now, the K79S80, and its length is 8.77 meters, now 2 whole senates longer than the Legends version, and about a Jawa shorter than the AAT. It had a width of 4.5 meters, almost 2 Wookiees across, which is a little bit less than half the AAT. While its height of 3.5 meters was about twice that of the TX-225 Occupier tank. The top speed remains the same, and we even learn its weight, 20,600 kilograms, or about 22 tons, roughly the weight of 25 dewbacks. But what's really incredible is this thing's shield generator and thick hull plating. It can take down multiple blows from an ATDP, TIE Fighters, and even the Ghost. All blasts that could punch a hole through most vehicles. But we often see the ITT taking hits without even breaking stride. In fact, even in this scene where the Ghost finally causes it to wreck, the actual armor is never penetrated. It seems like either the steering or the repulsors were damaged. It can also plow through the legs of an ATDP, or even push aside another ITT, though again without compromising the armor of either. As for its history, in Legends, the earliest we see the RTT used was in 0ABY, where Agent Marbarez is unsuccessful in capturing some rebel rookies. Then we learned that after the escape pod was found on Tatooine by a dewback squadron, the ITT squad was brought in to hunt down the droids containing the Death Star plans. they found the Jawas that sold these droids to the Lars farm before opening fire on the sandcrawler and ordering the Jawas to exit. As they did, the stormtroopers slaughtered them, and then staged it to look like an attack by Tusken Raiders. The RTT would once again be used on Tatooine sometime after the events of A New Hope. Several of them would be present for the testing of the Omega Frost superweapon. During this encounter, the RTTs chase Han and Luke across the Junlan Wastes, before they end up hitching a ride on something all too familiar to the RTT, a Jawa sandcrawler. As they traveled along, Luke and Han would spot another sandcrawler directly in the blast of the Omega Frost weapon. This caused everything in the surrounding area, the sandcrawler included, to be flash frozen. If this weapon could work on the scorching hot deserts of Tatooine, then it could work anywhere. And remember that these massive vehicles are like mobile fortresses containing almost an entire Jawa clan. The two Tag brothers would have a close-up view of the devastating effects of this weapon, but as soon as it was discovered that our heroes were close by, Orman sprung into action and would board an RTT to give chase. The sandcrawler containing Luke and Han made a direct course towards Mos Eisley. To lose the pursuing RTTs, Luke had an idea. While Han and the Jawas would drop containers of Skyhopper fuel, he would sit atop this massive vehicle and snipe the barrels, causing a massive chain reaction and wall of fire, and even exploding one of the barrels directly under an RTT. That was enough to break through the armor, and the Jawa were happy to get some revenge for those fallen sandcrawlers. During the Galactic Civil War, we'd see the RTT one more time during the Battle of Trask. These RTTs were actually a variant of the standard version. This kind removed the side racks and had all the troops inside, while also having this extra glass on the side for more visibility. And the last time we see its use in Legends was during the Imperial Civil War in 10 ABY. We'd see the transport being used on Coruscant during the hectic battles between Imperials still loyal to Palpatine and the other Coruscanti that no longer were. The RTTs here would be used to quickly transport supplies and troops across the dense cityscape of Coruscant. Now, the earliest that we see the ITT in canon was a year after the Galactic Empire was formed, in 18 BBY during the Battle of Dak City on Mon Calamari. Here we see something very interesting, but makes absolute sense given the time period. The ITT was transported to the Mon Calamari capital by LAATVs. Another interesting thing is seeing the AT-ATs and AT-DPs being used in this battle as well, which means they were already transitioning out of the Republic Walkers just 1 year after the Clone Wars. 14 years before the Battle of Yavin, we see several ITTs used by an Imperial outpost on the planet Kashyyyk. A handful of these came under attack by Saw Gerrera's partisans, the Kashyyyk Resistance, and an AT-AT commandeered by Cal Kestis. A few of them stationed at this base would be destroyed by this hijacked AT-AT. In 11 BBY, ITTs were deployed on the planet Gorse to hunt down the wanted fugitives Hera Syndulla and Kanan Jarrus. They were wanted for an assassination attempt on Count Vidian, and they were actually spotted by an Imperial transport, but Hera was able to set off an explosive, allowing them to escape. The most we would see the ITT would be between the years 5 BBY and 1 BBY on the planet Lothal. Given the ITT wasn't used for direct combat, the ITT would take on a number of roles instead, ranging from standard troop transport duty, prisoner transport, and even carrying cargo and food, such as Nelu runs. And when the Imperials wanted to show off their might, you could also find them in parades. We saw them being used to carry prisoners after an attack on the Samar family farm, which after the war was over was actually used by the family to transport their workers. But the Spectres would hijack many of them over the years. One such occasion was during the Empire Day celebration in 4 BBY, where both ITTs and AT-DPs participated in the parade. The celebration was cut short as the Spectres sabotaged the newly displayed TIE Advance model, which was the centerpiece of the celebration. Now on the run, they would commandeer an ITT to make a quick getaway. And that's where we really see how resilient this vehicle is, plowing through other vehicles with ease and really taking on a lot of damage. In the year 1 BBY, the ITTs on Lothal would be joined by the TX-225, yet another repulsor craft, but even more heavily armed and armored. During this battle, Hera Syndulla would commandeer an ITT after being shot down, and use this vehicle to rescue other downed rebel pilots. This transport would continue to be used by the Imperial-controlled worlds until the end of the Galactic Civil War, and so the last time that the Imps used them was during the Battle of Jakku in 5 ABY. But even though the Empire was finally defeated, remnant forces would go into hiding across the galaxy, and continue to operate with these Imperial vehicles. The ITT was no exception, and we see one under the service of Moff Gideon's forces on the planet Navarro. Here the ITT would be used to transport a squad of stormtroopers to Gideon's target, the mysterious child. This ITT has some minor details changed from the ones we saw earlier, and actually more closely resembles the Legends version, with that more rounded front and the sunken, forward-facing guns instead of those ball mounts. So that's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. The ITT was the very first toy made by Kenner of something that wasn't featured in the movies. This isn't the only Kenner toy to make a comeback in Star Wars, as the INT-4, MLC-3, and MTV-7 have all made comebacks not only in Legends, but are now a part of canon. The toy of the ITT came with this little informational booklet that gave some behind-the-scenes info on the ITT and some information regarding the Sandcrawler. The variant on Trask was first seen in the comic Boba Fett Overkill, and before making its debut in Star Wars Rebels and canon, its first appearance was in the junior novel Ezra's Gamble, set shortly before the events of the Rebel series. What's really cool was that this toy actually had a prototype that differed from how it looked in the final version. The entire front of the ITT was more ramp-like, ending in two pointed edges. The top-mounted round blaster turret is missing, instead replaced by a turbine engine, and it's said that the ride vehicle at Star Tours was based on this early design. But most important of all, remember, ships and vehicles always outlast their faction, and the Force will be with you, always. Imagine always being asked the same question, and always disappointing people with your response. What's up, Meta Nerds? This video will cover the Pantoran species, the people often confused for the much more mysterious and more powerful Chiss. They are classified as a sentient near-human species, an in-universe designation that means that they have a sense of self, can use tools, and have language, while also being in a roughly humanoid shape. Hailing from Pantora, their homeworld is actually a moon. Located in Sector P19 of the galactic map, you can find it in the Outer Rim territories. The planet they rotated around was Ordo Plutonia, a desolate ice world home only to the Tals and some non-sentient creatures.
And this is the planet's tropical zone!
Pantora itself was covered in marshlands, and by the time of the Clone Wars, the global population was around 1 billion. All Pantorans had this similar shade of blue, and as they explored out from their homeworld, other species often confused them with the Runian and Chiss species. The easiest way to tell them apart is the eyes, with almost all of them having yellow eyes and very few of them having black, while their hair could range from black, blue, white, and even purple. At an average height of 1.5 to 1.9 meters, or 4 foot 11 inches to 6 foot 3 inches, it's about an equal range to that of humans, and about twice the height of a Jawa. Similarly, they have two sexes and reproduce like most mammals. The only real biological difference other than their appearance is the fact that they can endure much colder temperatures than your average human, something we see on display with the difference in wardrobes seen here. Over countless millennia, their society was shaped by the slave and spice empires that surrounded them, as crime has always been big in the Outer Rim. With these scoundrels for neighbors, they developed a strong military tradition and were ruled by powerful families. These early days are described as a feudal society, with a hierarchy of lords ruling the land, each doing the balancing act of keeping the peasant Pantorans in line, while also trying to keep Pantora independent from the constant raids from slavers and spicers looking for a remote place to set up operation. Nobles would decorate their cheeks and forehead with these yellow markings that showed their family lineage, a sort of coat of arms right on your face. But over time, lower members of society picked up on this tradition as well, showing off their family and region. The only religion that outsiders are aware of is that of a moon goddess, most likely worshipped for millennia, and something that they kept up even as they became part of the larger galactic community. Relics and jewelry were also cherished by the Pantorans, but grew to become even more meaningful to the noble families after the transition from feudal lords to a democratic society. The details on how Pantora was unified is still unclear, but the result was a Pantoran assembly that ruled the entire planet. It can be presumed that many of these early elected leaders came from the same family as those feudal lords, but over time it would become one of the most egalitarian societies in the galaxy. And again, that especially stands out in the wild and dangerous regions of the Outer Rim. There were two leaders and sort of branches of government, a speaker who led the assembly of all the other local elected officials, and the chairman who had executive power, something like having a president and a senate or a house of representatives, where they would debate the nuance of law, what would be their sort of equivalent to the court. It's not really clear, but it seems to be debated between the speaker and elected representatives and the chairman. Interestingly, despite their democratic turn, those old traditions of strong leadership are evident in Chai Cho, who was the chairman of the Pantoran Assembly during the Clone Wars. He points out to Senator Ryo Chuchi that the reason Pantora has remained strong and independent throughout the years is by remaining ever vigilant against their enemies.
I have led our people since before you were born. I've seen 100 planets rise and fall through force of arms. If it's not the Separatists out there, then it's a malevolent and aggressive enemy nonetheless, and I will not let whoever it is jeopardize the security of the people of Pantora.
He also mentions that he has been leading his people since before she was born, so presumably for decades, which might give us a hint that there are no term limits on the chairman role. We know that since the 50s BBY, Plagueis and Palpatine had been pushing the galaxy towards war, and the Outer Rim especially became more dangerous. And so if he could keep Pantora safe during these decades, you could see why they might not want to get rid of him. And he even calls himself the Supreme Chairman and Exalted Ruler,
And as the supreme chairman and exalted ruler of Pantora, you will not command me to leave this planet or do anything else.
So perhaps he's just a small-scale blue Palpatine, using emergency powers to try and rule as dictator. We also see that he was willing to massacre the Tal species in retribution for attacking a Republic outpost, the result of which he saw as weakening his defenses against the CIS. He goes so far as to attempt to label them as animals to carry this out.
They are savages. Look at what they've done. They've slaughtered your troops. They belong to us. This whole system belongs to us.
And hints at an idea that is likely shared by many Pantorans, that their solar system was a birthright awarded them by being the only sentient species in the system. But as we mentioned earlier, that sentient status is a technical term, and is granted if you could find evidence of things like tool use and language, both of which the Jedi witnessed, and thus they could be covered by the Convention of Civilized Systems. As for why the Republic intervenes on Ordo Plutonia, it is because the Pantoran system is one of the few in the Outer Rim that doesn't want to join the CIS. Once the supposed savages and the Pantorans engage in battle, the Supreme Chairman is wounded. Though interestingly, when he's trying to be nice to the Senator, he drops the Supreme part of his title. But it doesn't work, and she tells him that the Pantoran Assembly has ruled him out of order.
Final command, as Chairman of Pantora, I order you to destroy the Tals.
The Pantoran Assembly has called you out of order. I am to negotiate peace.
Which shows whatever the extent of his extra powers and/or longer term, the ruling body was still functional and able to check him. With the peace forged via the Senator and the help of the Jedi, the Pantorans would recognize the Tals as their new sovereign neighbors. Many likely hoped that their effectiveness at killing droids, and even clones, would actually amplify their own fierce independence, and perhaps help to keep the system free from the machinations of the outside galaxy. Papa Noida would be elected the new chairman, but was quickly met with a Trade Federation blockade, which was explained as being simply a matter of debt, not something meant to influence the war.
The Trade Federation is neutral in this, but Pantora must pay its debt.
Conveniently, Dooku said the CIS would provide aid to the Pantoran people. And in order to further push Papa Noida, the Separatists hired bounty hunters, including Greedo, to kidnap the chairman's two daughters. Once this plot was revealed, the Pantorans were rescued, and the Trade Federation claimed that they had no idea of this plan, and in goodwill they would lift the blockade. Everyone knew the truth, that this was simply too obvious of a play. This world would remain out of the major battles of the Clone Wars, and even into the Imperial era there are no accounts of the Empire causing harm on Pantora. Perhaps this marshy world was of no value to, or a thorn in the side of Emperor Palpatine. So that's it for the Pantoran biology and history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. Most of the face markings were simply like makeup, but some would actually be tattoos, and instead of symbols it would be text from ancient Pantoran works. Some, like Lhasa Rhaim, a Pantoran pirate, had no face markings as they did not wish to represent their family ties, while others would use this tradition to show their allegiance to a new family, a crime family, like we see with this Pantoran member of the Black Sun crime syndicate. In the novel Dark Disciple we get some details about their architecture, being tall buildings topped with large gardens. In the new canon Thrawn trilogy, Thrawn is often confused as a Pantoran while he's on Coruscant. Also, George Lucas and his daughter appeared in Episode 3 as Pantorans, though at the time they were just being called Twi'leks. But most important of all, remember, if you get kidnapped, you gotta smash them in the head with religious statues to really get that blessing out of the gods. And the Force will be with you. Always. From guard duty on the Chimera and the Death Star, to single-handedly taking out Corvettes. What's up, Meta Nerds? This video is all about a Stormtrooper variant that everyone has seen, but most don't know how it evolved into an absolute unit. Their history starts back in the Clone Wars, branches off into this heavy assault mech variant, and was used by Thrawn and Tarkin to defend key assets. The Republic's Galactic Marines were the first to experiment with a clone armor with a built-in jetpack and breathing device, perfect for launching attacks from space, kinda like we see in some of the episodes of the Clone Wars. Commander Bakara was one of these Galactic Marines that used these prototype suits during the Battle of New Brunel, and this early iteration was much closer to the Zero-G Assault Trooper than what we would see with the standard Imperial Space Trooper, because depictions of this battle have the Marines encountering super battle droids in zero gravity. The droids were likely magnetized into place, and since we don't have any accounts of B-2s walking around on the outside of CIS capital ships, perhaps the location that they were assaulting was some sort of space station. As the Marines engaged the enemy, their built-in weapon systems failed, forcing them to rush the B-2s and fight them in hand-to-hand combat. Luckily, the mech suits that they were wearing provided enough power to rip these droids apart, limb by limb. So they quickly went from watching out for those wrist rockets, to watching whole droid arms harmlessly float away into space. News of what happened spread throughout the Republic Armed Forces. And although the weapons failing was a bad look for the prototype, it sure helped to solidify a ferocious reputation for the Galactic Marine Corps. The Empire would recognize the need for space troopers, but this would just be a simple adaptation to the Stormtrooper armor, attaching a jetpack and rebreather combo device, while also outfitting them with a T-21 heavy blaster, along with their standard E-11 and thermal detonator. The heavy blaster would be able to punch a hole in smaller boarding craft that might be trying to set down on an Imperial ship. And since the space troopers were always at least in pairs, this could be pretty effective. A rude welcome when a barrage of blaster fire comes from some part of the ship that you didn't think had any defenses. If the space trooper was on offense, this thermal detonator could act like a breaching charge, opening up the hole enough to drop in or even smash through the transparasteel of a cockpit or bridge. It was on this defensive role that we would see them on the Death Star, but we also learn how Thrawn used them to defend his flagship, the Chimera. Always thorough, the Chiss Grand Admiral had a protocol before he would tractor beam ships into the bay of his ISD. He would of course start with a battery of scans, but then he would send out teams of space troopers to survey the hull for any traps or potential threats. Having organic eyes and droid systems going over the same areas provided redundancies, making it less likely that both would miss something. And those organic eyes can't be hacked. Then he would send a survey team to enter and clean the inside of the ship before it was deemed safe enough to tractor aboard. With the Death Star, it just seems more like they have constant guard duty, but again, because these troopers' eyes can't be hacked. It's also a nice way to keep everyone busy. But they would go back to their Clone Wars mech power suit roots thanks to Rom Mak. This isn't confirmed, but lore states that he was an officer in the Clone Wars, who had a reputation for destroying droids in hand-to-hand combat. Perhaps he was also there during the debut of that prototype model over New Brunel, because his entire life was devoted to just two things, the military and cybernetics. For this, Palpatine put him at the head of the Dark Trooper project, but he also helped to create the Zero-G Assault Trooper. Here's a quote about them from the Imperial Handbook. Widely considered the best soldiers in the galaxy, Imperial space troopers specialize in assaulting and capturing enemy starships. Like the Imperial Marines, they serve aboard the vessels of the Imperial Navy. Unlike the Marines, space troopers operate best in the airless interstellar void. Other sources state that their deadly abilities are second only to the Royal Guard. 2 meters tall in this blaster-resistant mech suit, they would stand about as tall as a Wookiee. And this whole thing actually went over your standard Stormtrooper armor. It was built to be fast, powerful, and incredibly agile. It would take a while to be perfected, and are mostly seen with the Imperial Remnant, as the project wasn't even started until after the destruction of the first Death Star. With the Legends Thrawn, these two protected his flagship, the Chimera, and were so effective that Leia Organa Solo remarked that these were more like single-pilot spacecraft. Their weaponry included shoulder-mounted grenade launchers that could fire concussion grenades for pure destruction, or gas and stun grenades for capturing New Republic leaders. Both wrists contain laser cutters for carving their way into a ship's hull, along with a blaster cannon on the right arm for personnel, and a miniature proton torpedo for incoming ships. With all that, you can see why Leia said, quote, "A single space trooper was more than capable of breaching and seizing control of a blockade runner." And I'm sure Thrawn thought a single power-armored trooper taking out a CR-90 was a much better return on your credits than a Death Star. Both the NR and Imperial Remnant forces referred to them as the best troops in the galaxy, as being able to wield all of these abilities correctly took an incredible amount of training, and they could be quickly transported across the galaxy and dropped off in a hit-and-run style via these hyperspace pods or from a Gamma-class assault ship, which could deliver 40 space troopers at a time. Their only real problem was that they could be disabled by EMP bursts. But this is true of all starfighters as well, and perhaps the suit could turn itself on after a while. But of course, when disabled, they were extremely vulnerable. Crix Madine advised Rebels and later NR forces to always have EMP countermeasures ready when transporting high-value assets. And it was Wedge Antilles that noticed that although they were quick and nimble for a person in a mech suit, they still didn't compare to an actual starfighter. These space troopers would try to avoid dogfights and head straight for the target ship. But any reasonably trained pilot should be able to make quick work of them if you could get to them before they breached the target hull. Their most notable use was during the Battle of Sluis Van in 9 ABY. This is a major NR shipyard, and the space troopers planned on capturing several capital ships to strengthen the Imperial Remnant. A quick response led to all of them being shot down, but the final two were able to self-destruct, resulting in some major hull damage to a Corvette. So that's it for the history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. Bakara's Clone Wars era backstory with these early prototypes was from the old StarWars.com page and can now only be accessed via a backup link. And this big mech version came from the game Super Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back, and they also appeared in the Heir to the Empire book and comic adaptation. For those normal ones on the Death Star, Joe Johnston actually played both of these guys. This is actually shot split screen because one of the suits was stolen. I tried looking up if this was ever recovered, but couldn't find anything. So if you know this suit's whereabouts, do the right thing. Reach out to contact@metanerds.com, send it on over, and you can remain anonymous. And yes, despite it being a priceless collectible, I will be wearing it. Often. And in 2015, they came out with a really cool model of these guys, which finally confirmed the heavy blaster that they had. But most important of all, remember, if we all meditate on the Force, we can convince them to make a Rainbow Six Siege style game with space troopers. And the Force will be with you. Always. Nothing worse than watching your loved one get ripped through the wall and squished like a grape in your town square. What's up, Meta Nerds? This video is all about the UATT Walker, aka the Urban Assault Triped Transport. It has some really cool new features, and the First Order used these in a truly terrifying way. And unlike the ATST, this one may have actually been a transport. This new walker was manufactured by Kuat and Tralla, the same people that made the M6 and Capital ships for the First Order, which was the merger of the centuries-old company Kuat Drive Yards that made all the Republic and Imperial walkers. Its cost is unknown, but with a height of 6.52 meters or 21 feet, it was about 2/3 the height of an ATST, and nearly twice the height of the ATRT. As for its top speed, it was tied with the ATST at 90 km per hour or 56 miles per hour, making it about 1.5 times the ATT. Due to automation advancements, the crew is now down to just one, removing the co-pilot/gunner that we see in the predecessor, all while increasing the amounts of blaster cannons. There was this chin-mounted double laser cannon with targeting sensor array right underneath, and this weapons cluster on the side of the cockpit, containing a heavy blaster cannon and 2 light repeater cannons. On the other side of the cockpit was the spotlight, but of course the main event here is the CAP-5 activator arm. It can tuck up underneath the walker when not being used, but whenever the path was blocked by debris or dissidents, the UATT could handle it. The First Order went towards more specialization with their walkers, increasing the size of the AT-AT with the AT-M6, but making the UATT smaller than the AT-ST. When the First Order wanted to take control of a city without leveling it, they couldn't send in the huge guerrilla walker. But in dense urban areas, this triped walker would be able to stomp around without leveling the whole block. If civilians try to set up a blockade, the arm could easily pull it apart while still laying down fire, which was strong enough to be deadly to personnel, especially with that heavy laser cannon that could punch through any armor and overwhelm a personal energy shield, without having the missiles or grenades of the ATST that might just blow down the whole building. You also see that it's an armored passenger cabin with this entry hatch for FO stormtroopers to deploy from. It seems like you could probably fit around 6 troopers in this area. And this is a bit of speculation, but I think a lot of these design features point to an interesting way that these troops would enter and exit. See how it has these digitigrade legs that bend backwards, and we know that this top part can rotate 360 degrees. Seeing how this armored hood of the passenger section slopes down, when this walker were to sit down as low as it can, and then rotate the top completely around, the hood would come down to meet the claw arm. Perhaps the troops could climb up the hand and arm, over the hood and into the hatch, while the walker could still be facing the enemy laying down covering fire. Objectively, maybe not a brilliant way to do it, but surprisingly more reasonable than a lot of other vehicles in this galaxy. This armored hood also acts as a great way to protect the vulnerable power cells from any top-down attacks that you might expect in a dense urban environment, or from an incoming fighter or gunship. When occupying a hostile city, the trooper squadron would often escort on foot alongside this walker. The armored top would protect the walker, while these extra pieces of riot armor on the limbs would protect the troops. Escorted by these troops on the ground meant that you had protection from the rear and the sides, and could provide quick eliminations to any resistance that might run up with an explosive, as running out of an alley and lobbing a sticky detonator onto the underside is the biggest threat to this walker. But it also has a psychological trick up its sleeve. Few things would be as terrifying as having this arm smash through your residence and rip you into the grip of the First Order. But to terrify all of your neighbors into submission, they would bring dissidents out into public places, parade them through the streets held high up in this claw, and either read off your crimes before hauling you away, or, more often, they would simply execute you on the spot, crushing you in the UATT's grip, juicing you into the public square as an example for your entire community. That's actually the dark extra part to that street-level escort. The FO Stormtrooper Blaster, the F-11D, has a stun mode like most rifles, and so they could easily paralyze a whole crowd if they were deemed to be inciting a riot, at which point the UATT got to play the galaxy's darkest version of the claw game. All of these tactics were used to subjugate the previously lawless Kijimi City. So that's it for the UATT, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. The FO was inspired to make this vehicle from the design of the AT-AP. but instead of a long-range cannon, they wanted something that could work more like a SWAT van. Comparisons to those other walkers comes from the Encyclopedia of Starfighters and Other Vehicles, while the UATT details come from the Rise of Skywalker Visual Dictionary. So that's it for the Urban Assault Triped Transport. But most important of all, remember, you can support the Resistance, but try not to get you and your neighbors juiced. And the Force will be with you. Always. TIE fighters are always changing to meet the needs of their time. What's up, Meta Nerds? This video will break down the new Outlander TIE fighter. We'll see why this design makes sense for a fractured Imperial remnant, and even some cool behind-the-scenes facts on how this almost appeared in The Force Awakens. Of course, like all TIE variants, it retains a lot of the key looks and features of the TIE LN, but the most obvious changes are these S-foil folding wings. But why this change? Well, it's important to understand that the TIE fighter was designed with an assumed infrastructure around them. It's cheaper to just build the hangar racks and specialized landing pad equipment once, and have all of that safely on a base or a carrier, instead of building landing gear into each of the countless TIEs pumped out over the decades. The sad truth was that TIE fighters were disposable. Those were the things getting blown up. It's much cheaper to build these permanent catwalk structures in Star Destroyers and Death Stars, or just have a simple set of stairs on wheels that you can roll into place. This low cost, just 3 times of Ultra Droid, and less than half an X-Wing, allowed them to be pumped out at such a rate that any destroyed by rebels would be quickly and effortlessly replaced, which had a very demoralizing effect. They are famously weak, and there were even popular TIE fighter slogans like "No shields, all guts." But I think there's some strong evidence that the Outlander TIE was upgraded. When the Mando latches onto the TIE, it seems like he thought he could just fire through the glass. It would be odd if he didn't think that this was transparasteel. He must have some reason to think that this would work, so perhaps this TIE was reinforced. If not, I think that certainly the hull was reinforced. One is simply the fact that a Moff wouldn't be riding around in a flimsy TIE fighter of the line, it's just too risky. And proof of this is that these 2 explosives don't set the whole TIE fighter ablaze. It doesn't even sever the wing, it just blows apart some of the top half, as if it didn't penetrate the whole armor, but instead the blast was directed up and outward and tore up the more fragile solar collector array. You also get a glimpse at a really useful detection method new to this model, which shows you when something is placed on the hull, and most likely would have provided other damage reports and tactical information. As the TIE falls to the ground, we see that apparently the ejector seat mechanism was removed. Perhaps this was done to clear out some room for the landing gear. Interestingly, the 3 legs of this landing gear, 2 to the sides and 1 out the rear, are very similar to those of the X-Wing. Some speculate that this, combined with the S-foils, which bring its landed position into this X shape, may point to the Outland TIE being a retrofit that incorporated some X-Wing parts, perhaps captured by Imperial remnant forces. That or Incom Corporation had worked with Sinar Fleet Systems to create this variant. Incom originally made the X-Wings for the Empire, so I could see this being the case. Shields and hyperdrives are often the most expensive parts of a ship, and so your standard TIE fighter has neither. And although those might be useful, I don't see any evidence to think that this variant has any either. We don't know for sure how large a force the Moff has, but he must at least have some large transports, if not a capital ship. There's various troops like regular stormtroopers, scout troopers, and death troopers, and even vehicles like speeder bikes and ITTs, all of which points to some sort of carrier. And so this Outlander TIE may still just be a short-range fighter. But remember, the TIE LN was never supposed to be setting down on strange terrain. They were most often in escort and patrol roles, with only occasionally ever engaging enemies. Once the Empire was killed and that well-oiled war machine started to fracture, things had to change. The TIE still had good firepower and excellent speed, so they were still really valuable. But now you would need TIEs that could land on worlds that you wanted to bring under your particular rule, as Imperial warlords took a more direct role in holding on to regional power. So hopefully you see how these small changes really do make a big difference in a time of a fractured empire. As for the behind-the-scenes facts, I just wanted to point out that there is some mechanism that lifts him out of the cockpit for dramatic flair, and conveniently we don't see him actually do the less graceful slide off onto the ground. Also, this design was first seen in concept art for The Force Awakens, created by the amazing Doug Chiang, who is responsible for a lot of the best stuff of the prequels, stuff like the Naboo Starfighter and pod racers. And in this episode we saw that of course the Darksaber, a form of lightsaber, can cut through the hull, which would be true even if it has the thicker hull plating that I think it has. And this is connected to Gideon's past on Mandalore. He was in the Imperial Security Bureau and helped with the siege of Mandalore, and later would become the Marshal of Mandalorian space. So that's it for the Outlander TIE. But most important of all, remember, if this really is a combo of TIE Fighter and X-Wing, then it has brought balance to the Starfighters. And the Force will be with you. Always. Sometimes stormtroopers and walkers aren't enough. Sometimes you have to send in a vehicle so powerful, immobilizing it doesn't make it any less deadly. What's up, meta-nerds? In today's video, we'll be talking about the Imperial Patrol Speeder from Legends. A very cool vehicle that only appeared once in a Star Wars newspaper comic. The Imperial Patrol Speeder was a vehicle seen on the planet Aridus in the year 0 ABY. Luke and an imposter, Ben Kenobi, fought against this repulsor tank on their journey to destroy an Imperial fortress located on this planet, and save a local species known as the Chubits. Unfortunately, there are no sources that give the exact measurements of this vehicle, so we'll have to dive into a little bit of speculation regarding its stats. We don't know the manufacturer, but this repulsor tank shares many design characteristics with products of Rathana Heavy Engineering, like the TX-130, 2M, and TX-225. And in comparison with the 2M and TX-130 in particular, the Patrol Speeder shares these main two viewports on each side of the vehicle. Now for its size, we'll use this photo of Luke looking down at it, and we can get a little bit of scale on this vehicle. And we can also do some deduction with the fact that each of these pods contains a single gun mount with two vision ports, which most likely means that one or two guys crewed each of these guns. To get some rough measurements, we'll compare it to the aforementioned pic with Luke. And by using this 3D model, we can get a much more accurate sense of the height. By using this human model as a reference, the Patrol Speeder is almost exactly 3 persons tall. Luke has a height of 5 foot 9 inches, so that times 3 is about 17 feet 3 inches. So we'll go with a little more than 17 feet. To compare its height with another ground vehicle, the AT-AT, which was 74 feet, so it's about a quarter of that height, or about a Jawa taller than an AAT. For width, the Patrol Speeder is 6 persons wide with about an extra foot, or about 34.5 feet, about a Wookiee less than an AAT. For its length, the Patrol Speeder is about the same, about a foot less than 6 Lukes, or 33.5 feet, almost equal to the AAT. All these attributes together give us a vehicle that might be 4 times smaller than the AT-AT, but may pack even more firepower. This repulsor tank was heavily armed on each side, having 2 forward-facing blaster cannons, 2 side-mounted blaster cannons, and then an additional 4 side-mounted blaster cannons mounted on a turret. These smaller laser cannons were all mounted in spherical barbettes that provided better aiming and a larger firing cone for the guns. The main turret was armed with 1 large gun, and although we don't know the power output, it is shown in the comic as firing a beam-like weapon. So perhaps instead of a normal blaster cannon, the main gun was instead a laser cannon or even a turbo laser, something similar to what we see in the CIS's AAT. What's interesting to know is that compared to other Imperial vehicles, the Patrol Speeder's main gun is very long, extending outwards from the body a considerable amount, which makes me wonder if this thing was designed for some long-range accuracy. The bottom of this repulsor tank has several circular objects, which although we don't really get a good visual of, this is most likely the repulsor system that gets it off the ground. And there appear to be these 2 hatches on top of the vehicle for entering and exiting. In comparison to other vehicles of the Empire, its use as a patrol vehicle with so much firepower and perhaps an incredible accuracy and range with that main gun, it could be both more deadly than the AT-AT while also being a lot harder to take down. As for its history, the Imperial Patrol Speeder would be used by the Galactic Empire as early as 0 ABY, only a few months after the destruction of the first Death Star. They would mostly play a defensive role and be spread across the galaxy protecting various bases crucial to the Empire. One such example would be on the planet Aridus, where many of this type were used to patrol the perimeter of the Imperial fortress known as the Iron Tower. The Iron Tower was a massive base used by the Imperials on Aridus to control the local population called the Chubits. This structure would act as a long-range transmission tower and had to be built large enough to overcome the dense ionized atmosphere. One of the side effects of this incredibly powerful transmitter signal was that its frequencies actually damaged the nervous system of the Chubit people. This outcome had a good side effect for the Imperials, as it prevented the Chubits from attempting any sort of rebellion. The tower would also serve as a base for Darth Vader, where he would create a very interesting plan to lure Luke to the planet. Using an actor that resembled Obi-Wan, Vader sent this actor to inspire the Chubits to attempt a rebellion. On one occasion, the actor would rescue a rebel agent, who returned to Yavin 4 to tell news that Ben Kenobi had returned. Upon hearing this, Luke immediately departed to Aridus to meet his master, who mysteriously disappeared. Upon arriving, Luke would encounter the imposter, but actually believe that it was the real Obi-Wan, and this actor was even able to make it look like he had force powers, all thanks to some clever tech. The actor was instructed to lure Luke to the Iron Tower, where together with Vader, they would kill the young Jedi. But on their way, they would encounter an Imperial Patrol Speeder blocking their path. The vehicle would force them to the high ground to avoid the multitude of weapons this machine used. They were almost killed by the main gun, but as it approached, it continued firing on the 2, and as it was distracted with the Jedi, a handful of Chubits had set up on a cliffside directly behind the large repulsor tank. Despite its powerful weapon, the Patrol Speeder unfortunately had an Achilles heel. A direct hit to the main thruster would render the craft immobile, but despite losing its repulsors, the speeder was all but defenseless. Thanks to the large amount of smaller guns placed around the body, the speeder was still able to fire these weapons even while incapacitated. An impressive feat, and something some Star Destroyers could learn from. The Chubits continued to fight the down speeder as the imposter Obi-Wan headed towards the Iron Tower. Luke asked Ben to help him take out the speeder once and for all, and save several of the Chubit resistance fighters. Although he had a strict mission to complete, the actor indulged Luke's request, and the two went to destroy the vehicle. The fakey one Kenobi used his lightsaber to slash the speeder's power cells, causing a massive explosion which completely destroyed the tank and almost killed both Luke and this actor. The two would eventually make it to the Iron Tower, but seeing Luke's kind actions would convince him to sacrifice himself in order to disable the Iron Tower and attempt to kill Vader. The tower was heavily damaged, but Vader would survive, only being trapped momentarily. And unfortunately, this would be the only time we see the Imperial patrol speeder in action. But we can assume this heavy repulsor tank could be used across the galaxy whenever there was a large fortress in need of patrolling. So that's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. It first appeared in the Star Wars newspaper comic, The Return of Ben Kenobi, and would end up being its only appearance. And there are actually two vehicles with the name of Imperial Patrol Speeder. The planet the IPS was used on, Aridus, was planned to make an appearance in the campaign of the game Empire at War, where a ground invasion by rebels was made to free the local population. It is directly stated that Chubits would be supplied with T-2B and T-4B tanks, which now that we see what they were up against, makes complete sense. I know I'd like to see a tank fight between these three. Well, what's funny is that the manufacturer of these rebel ground vehicles, Utrain Trakata, was actually based on Aridus. They were also responsible for the T-3B series and the MZ-8 pulse cannon. Other than this, Aridus appears numerous times throughout Legends, even being a holdout for the Yuuzhan Vong after their invasion. But the planet has even made its way back into canon, where it is mentioned in the Star Wars Force Awakens beginner game. So that's it for this incredibly obscure heavy repulsor tank. But most important of all, remember, sometimes Vader hits the spice when he comes up with these schemes to capture Luke. And the Force will be with you. Always. It's hard to fight off claims of corruption when the politicians are the ones riding around in the flyest shuttles. What's up, meta nerds? In today's video, we're going to be talking about the H-2 Executive Shuttle, a smaller shuttle used during the time of the Republic, mainly by senators and other high-ranking officials. The H-2 was constructed by Slane & Corporal, the same company that would produce the V-19 Torrent and T-6 shuttle for the Republic, and who would later go on to produce the B-Wing and MG-100 Star Fortress. Its cost is unknown, but the H-2 was 14.6 meters long, or 48 feet, making it about 8 meters shorter than the T-6 shuttle, or equal to the length of an ARC-170 plus a Wookiee. It had a decent top speed of 875 km per hour or 544 miles per hour, making it about 50 km per hour faster than the new class. For crew, it would only require a single pilot, but had comfortable accommodations for up to 5 passengers and a bunch of luggage. The H-2 had a much more sleek design compared to the other shuttles in this era used by the Republic. The majority of those shuttles were built by Cygnus Spaceworks, like the Nu and Edda, and they had a much more utilitarian design, whereas the H-2 seems to be designed for looks. The front cabin had plenty of transparent steel windows, giving the passengers and pilot a beautiful view. The wings of the H-2 were able to fold closer to the body, making this craft easier to store in smaller spaces, and this wing folding feature is a staple of Slane & Corporal products. Now we're unsure if the cutouts in these wings serve a purpose or if they're just to make it look cool, as this was a luxury craft meant to make a statement. And given that it was mainly a diplomatic ship, it had no onboard weapons. And surprisingly, if you go with the stock model, you don't even get a hyperdrive. First we ever see the H-2 shuttles in the year 21 BBY at the peak of the Clone Wars. Given that now it was a galaxy at war, the Republic knew that the capital of Coruscant was always under threat of invasion, and that the Supreme Chancellor would be the #1 target. In the event of an emergency, an H-2 was installed inside of the Republic Executive Building as a means to escape from any threat that might arise. This H-2 is painted a dark blue color, very similar to the Senate Commandos, and it would have this Senate symbol on the bow. Despite the capital city being so well protected, it would eventually come under attack, but not from the Separatists, instead from the mighty Zillo Beast. This creature would rampage through the city in search of the one who ordered its imprisonment, Chancellor Palpatine. It would finally find its target in the Republic Executive Building and begin its attack. To protect the Chancellor, Anakin, Padme, and their droids would board the H-2 stationed in that building. It was able to quickly take off, but it was grabbed by the Zillo Beast, and then it tried to crush everyone inside. What we see here is either a testament to the Zillo Beast's intelligence, choosing not to just crush the craft, but to look Palpatine in the eye before he killed him. Or perhaps the H-2 is so well constructed that he actually couldn't crush it. It's very easy to think that the escape craft made for Chancellor Palpatine would have some heavy modifications. Reinforced hull bracing, thicker plate armor, all kinds of stuff to make this ship more secure during an attack. Just how luxury vehicles here on Earth are often reinforced with added layers of defense for VIPs. In order to escape this attack, Anakin would use his lightsaber to slice the forward section of the shuttle in half, disconnecting the part that the beast was holding onto and letting the cockpit slide off onto the building. They would then escape on foot thereafter. So despite it being cut in two, the H-2 did still buy the Chancellor some time, even if it couldn't get him off of Coruscant. Now that's the only time we see it in the service of the Republic, but interestingly, the H-2 ended up in the hands of some Separatists. In fact, we actually see it with Separatist senators more than Republic ones. This either shows that Slain and Corporal, despite producing one of the main fighters of the Republic, as well as a shuttle used exclusively by the Jedi, was still neutral in this war and sold ships to whoever it wanted. Or that several of these H-2s were produced and purchased before the outbreak of the Clone Wars. Both are plausible theories, so let me know what you think down in the comments. We see an H-2 that is painted in old Senate red used by CIS Senator Mina Bonteri. Ahsoka and Padme would hitch a ride on this particular H-2 to meet with Bonteri behind the Republican Jedi's backs in an attempt to start peace talks to end the war. What's interesting to note about this H-2 is that its wings don't fold down and then backwards. Instead, they just fold up. Why it's different with this particular version is unknown. Perhaps it's an older model, because this version would take up more space in a conventional hangar. Rush Clovis, another Separatist senator, would also have an H-2 shuttle for personal use. This one would be named the Scipio, after his homeworld, and will be painted a goldish bronze color, and this H-2 has the same folding wing action as the one we saw with Palpatine. Once again, Padme would be on board, as she would take the Scipio to Clovis's personal residence during their meeting with the banking clan, all in an attempt to pull a loan for the Republic in the year 19 BBY. And despite its widespread use, it's actually something that we don't see any more of after this year. So that's it for its history, and the only cool behind the scenes facts is that it made its debut in the Clone Wars animated series, with its first appearance in the episode The Zillo Beast Strikes Back. The red variant is seen in the episode Heroes on Both Sides, and the Scipio is in the episode An Old Friend. While some of the extra details about this come from the new canon book Star Wars Encyclopedia of Ships and Other Vehicles. But most important of all, remember, cutting it in half with a lightsaber does void the warranty, and the Force will be with you, always. What's up, Meta Nerds? Gonna keep this one short and to the point about a couple parts from the Episode 9 Visual Dictionary. Two questions that many fans had about the Exagol fleet were how was it built and how was it kept a secret? It could have been the case that these ships, like the Ziston and the TIE Daggers, were built somewhere else and secretly transported to Exagol. If not completely finished, most of the major work like the hulls and reactor installation, etc., could have been done at some major shipyard and just transported here. Because just by looking at it, Exagol doesn't seem like it has a lot going on. Just that massive structure that we find Palpatine and the Sith cultists in. But a couple details point out that for sure everything was built on Exagol. Not on the surface exposed to that dangerous atmosphere, but actually inside of the planet. Vader and Palpatine had wayfinders to get to Exagol, and even if somehow you did know where it was in the unmapped unknown regions, you couldn't get there without this device showing you the route. Palpatine and or Vader used theirs to transport the early equipment and cultists that would work on this contingency plan, years before the events of the original trilogy, or perhaps even alongside the films. Enormous chambers were carved out of the rock, with hidden hangar doorways that would eventually let out these fleets. This serves as just another layer of avoiding detection, in that even if somehow a probe just happened upon Exagol by sheer chance, the atmosphere would quickly destroy it. And any data or images that may have been sent back wouldn't show a massive shipyard in full production. Kinda like how we landed probes on Venus, but they don't last very long. If it was a really lucky probe, it might have seen the odd building we find Palps in, but I don't know if that would have been as immediate a problem if you showed the New Republic Senate. Just some weird old abandoned Sith relic. So now for the how. Well, the materials are actually shipped from Kuat and Trala in Sinar Jamis, the same company that made all of the major ships and vehicles for the First Order. And the merger of the two companies, Kuat Drive Yards and Sinar Fleet Systems, who were the major suppliers to the Empire and Republic. Sith loyalists within those companies made it so that certain raw materials disappeared, fell off the transport as it were, and presumably with Vader's Wayfinder, maybe Snoke or some other agents would escort the goods to Exagol. There, the massive team of Sith Eternal scientists, technicians, and shipwrights put it to work not just making the same Imperial ships, but actually innovating them, creating things like a highly advanced TIE fighter and a capital ship-mounted cannon with similar power to a Death Star. Now to me, the part about making raw materials disappear seems plausible enough. If you watch a lot of true crime documentaries, people often buy materials from different places as to not set off a red flag. But I don't see why it wouldn't have just been easier for Palpatine as Emperor to just have a massive amount of materials all shipped out at once to Exagol. Even with democratically elected governments, there are parts of the military budget that are not disclosed because they are for classified projects. And we know that just moments after the Clone Wars, Palpatine was able to keep the Death Star a secret, at a time when the Imperial Senate still had some power. Wouldn't it be easier for the Emperor to just make a massive shipment of all the materials at once when he had this privilege as ruler of the galaxy? Instead of while he's in hiding, hoping that none of those many Sith loyalists embedded in different companies ever betray you, or even accidentally slip up, or is being actively monitored by the New Republic or Resistance. And think about just how many trips they had to make to Exagol, and with 50% of your keys. The Wayfinder is like a set of keys needed to enter the planet, and so somebody had to have only one of the 2 keys in order to transport these materials. Just seems like way too many places for something to go wrong here. Could have just had a massive amount of materials secret away under the stamp of a classified research project, and Palps would ride along with it to check on the site and ensure its arrival. Even if you needed a long train of ships to carry all that material, you could just do what Rey did, and have the Emperor in one with his Wayfinder, and all the other ships following the path. The rest of the plan is the same, you just leave everybody in that underground base in Exagol, and Palps leaves and goes back to ruling the Empire, knowing that he has his set-it-and-forget-it Sith fleet crockpot going just in case Sith hits the fan. But what do you think of all this? Do you like the explanation from the visual dictionary, my modified way to carry out this plan, or were you thinking something totally different? Kinda like I said with the Sitharian Rule of 2 applying to Kylo and Rey, I actually think this whole secret stored up fleet is a cool idea, even if it could have been portrayed better across the trilogy. But again, let me know what you think down in the comments below. But most important of all, remember, it's not turtles, but contingency plans all the way down. And the Force will be with you. Always. Sure, there's going to be a rant about this on Mayfield's Monday Morning podcast. What's up, Meta Nerds? In this video, we're going to talk about how the Intergalactic Banking Clan funded the First Order. How their fleet was built up is something that's been talked about in a lot of other YouTube videos over the years. But there's this very simple detail that I kept laughing at how obvious it was every time I saw it. But I never got around to making a video on it. So the companies that made everything for the First Order are Kuat and Trala and Sinar Jamis. Kuat and Sinar have been around forever making ships and vehicles for both the Republic and then the Empire. But what are Trala and Jamis? Well, if you look at their wiki pages, they don't have any details about them in canon. In fact, the only info we have is their location in the galaxy, which is literally flanking the planet Munilinst, the home of the Intergalactic Banking Clan, the organization that funded the Republic's efforts to buy more clones, arms, and armor, while also providing loans to all the companies of the CIS. They swore neutrality, even had a seat in the Senate, but all knew that a galaxy at war was great for the Banking Clan. This was something Padme, Bail Organa, and many others railed against in the Senate Rotunda. It cannot be an accident that canon lore has caused these well-known companies, Kuat and Sinar, to merge with these worlds that have no other details about them. And then of all the other planets in the galaxy, put them both right next to the unscrupulous Banking Clan. Working with a rogue military force had to be something prohibited by the New Republic, but I doubt that mattered. And though the First Order operated outside of the civilized galaxy, and may have been operating in completely different currencies, they were carrying out operations in NR space for decades. The book Bloodlines gets into how Leia uncovered that the First Order was funding terrorist groups and criminal empires to simultaneously keep the NR occupied and create a public demand for a strong dictatorship. The Mun-run IBC would have been able to set up accounts to convert currency, and perhaps have a whole web of accounts to make the First Order's funneling of money harder to track. Ill-gotten credits in Republic space had to move around to other FO assets, and even back out to the FO in the unknown regions. While money brought in from the First Order's fiefdoms would also flow to those crime syndicates that Leia discovered. All of this requires a bank to shuffle around credits without asking any questions, and there are many arcs in the Clone Wars that show us that this is the IBC, which is again located on Munilinst, flanked by those 2 worlds that got paired up with the illustrious Kuat and Sinar. I don't think canon could have made it any clearer. Now in Legends, Trala is a free commerce planet, and Jamis actually had the sizable Galentro heavy work shipyards. Could say that for dozens of other worlds throughout the galaxy, and again the fact that the canon map puts it right next to the home of the IBC seems to be spelling it out that they were helping to fund the First Order, by at least making loans to Kuat and Trala and Sinar Jamis, if not also that whole credit shuffling multiple account tricks to hide their shady dealings. So what do you think of all this? Was it obvious to you that somehow the IBC would be behind this, or do you think it's odd that they were able to get away with it again? Also consider the fact that they are intergalactic, as in different galaxies, meaning who knows what kinds of similar shadowy organizations are being funded by them. And if they could go to other galaxies, the fact that the unknown regions is relatively more obscure shouldn't have been that big of a hurdle. So let me know what you think down in the description. But most important of all, remember, Hosnian Prime might still be around if some NR senators subscribe to the Mayfield podcast. And the Force will be with you. Always.